Good morning. It's time for me to give an art update. Let me mention that it is still very overcast and dark over here, but at least it's not raining. It was sprinkling on and off yesterday. It was quite gloomy, but I hope it brightens up a little bit today. So before I talk a little bit about my art progress, first I'm going to show you a couple of comics that I read last night. These two comics are from 1982, and they are the comic adaptation of the famous film that starred Arnold. The film really needs no introduction. This is interesting for a few reasons. I believe yesterday I mentioned that adaptations like this were very they filled an important niche back then because this was a time before VCRs. I have a novelization of this film, but aside from maybe some magazine photographs, maybe some pictures in the newspaper, it was more difficult to relive a film back then, unless the film happened to be in town and people could go there more than once. So these comic books were sort of a kind of an interesting product of their time. I'm sure there are still comic book versions of some films, but those fulfill a slightly different need. So, as was kind of expected at the time period, we have a 2 hour film that has to be crammed into two comics. So this is more of a summary of a film rather than a straight comic book adaptation. There are differences in this version from the film. I'm sure they just had a script, maybe not even the final script. I'm not even sure they even had photographs of the actors. This looks more like the comic version of Conan rather than Arnold, but I mean there are some there are similarities to the actors. This, of course, had to have been drawn months before the film could be released in order to be printed at approximately the same time. So Stanley presents. The adaptation art is by John Buscema, and of course it's a Laurentiis film. Robert E. Howard is probably mentioned somewhere in here. I can't quite read the small type. But anyway, this is almost more of some illustrations of a script rather than an actual comic. Because ideally, a comic book version of this film should be a fat manga volume. This should be several hundred pages, because there should be pages of setting up Conan's village. I mean, we could just have a couple pages just of Conan's blacksmith father working, and then later on we can have a conversation. But here, Conan's entire childhood is basically a page. I mean, we never really get to see the mother, except for here. We have the village, we have the massacre. We don't really get to set up Rexor and Thulsa Doom because they have such page limitations. I wish these two comics just focused on the first 10 minutes of the film. I mean, that could be a whole comic book, just the village. But anyway, we have to move on. So we very swiftly go through the film. Now, in this comic book, this heavy narration is done in Conan's voice, which is a little odd when we think about Arnold's accent. It does make for interesting reading. In the film, of course, this is narrated by Mako, who plays the wizard. I don't remember the wizard's name. But he gives a very operatic performance. By the way, in the film, yes, we do see the heads of Conan's parents. In the television versions, this was always cut out, but I do remember in the DVDs we get to see that. Young Conan says, "Men will die for this." He never says that in the film. I bet that's a line from the comics. But anyway, we quickly go through the Wheel of Pain. Conan becomes a gladiator. I noticed that we have these goblin or orc-like men who are not in the film. Once again, perhaps this is an embellishment of the comic. perhaps there's something in that version of the script, etc. Conan is very talkative, unlike the film version, but some of that is just because of space limitations. It's a lot like how in a radio drama, when, Dick Tracy has to say, "I see you're carrying a gun," because in radio we have to describe everything. So Arnold's first line in the movie is the famous half quotation from Genghis Khan: to crush your enemies, to see them driven before you, etc. See, that should be the end of the comic. This whole thing should be Conan's childhood, and then the first words he says should be the very last page, when he has become this barbarian warrior, and that's the end of the comic. That's the whole story, and that would really bring that would have a strong impact to Conan's development as a character. But once again, we just don't have time for that in such an adaptation like this. Here we have the Atlantean King. It's a very spooky scene in the film. Once again, this could be a whole story here. Conan is chased by wolves. He finds an old tomb. There are bones of giants. He gets a sword. It looks like the giant's about to come to life. That's a whole story right there. Then we have the witch, and then Conan makes a friend. Before the internet, we had to advertise comics like this, like a catalog. We meet Subutai, who is kind of a Mongolian steppe warrior. Cerebus. Blah, blah, blah. And we come to the city where we are introduced to the Jamestown cult of Thulsa Doom, and we meet Valeria. In the film, we have a hilarious puppet as a giant serpent, and I actually I kind of like that. I like practical effects as much as possible, and the comic ends with getting the eye of the serpent, which is actually vaguely based on the short story. Was it the Tower of the Elephant, I believe, which has been adapted many times in comics. All right, so we've got to cram the second hour of the film into this comic very quickly. I don't remember the scene with the moat in the film. Okay, so this whole scene, this is actually one of the few bits of comedy in the film, so I wish this had been drawn out, but we get to see Conan, Subutai, and Valeria living the high life, and Conan's face falls in the mush. So that could be a whole comic. That should be several pages. And then we have the line, King Osric, is that Max von Sydow, I think, maybe? This is also a famous line from the film. What daring, what insolence, what unbridled arrogance. Of course, that comes really from the actor. But in order to have that same equivalent in a comic book, you would have to break this up into many panels. One panel will be the king, what daring, the next panel, what insolence, third panel, the third line, and then turn the page, and your punchline is the king saying, I salute you, whole page. Because space in a comic book equals time. I mean, once again, it's not the fault of these, of John Buscema at this time period, because he just had a screenplay. They probably only had a week or so to work on this. They were just cranking them out as quickly as possible. It's just, with hindsight, now that we can really think about the story, and now that we really can think of comics as a medium, we see the best way that could have been portrayed. Now, this wizard is Mako in the film. When this was made, I guess they had no idea who that was going to be. So, I mean, once again, we're just rushing through the story. Thulsa Doom, James Earl Jones, is barely in the comic. In the film, he is such a massive presence. He is evil incarnate in the film. It's quite creepy. And then we have the scene where the ghosts are going to take Conan to the other world. And once again, this should be the end of a chapter. This is the most dramatic part of the film, where Valeria trades her life for Conan, and an artist can be very creative with the ghosts. Here, Thulsa Doom turns to a snake. That should be a whole chapter. I mean, seeing the actual evil. Now here we have these orc goblin men who are not in the film, who sort of live in Mordor, inside a volcano perhaps, not in the film. Once again, this is so rushed, we don't really have time to appreciate it. And I mean, we hear the climax of the film. Valeria gives her life for Conan, and then we burn her body, and it's like, and then Conan has his revenge, and she's going to come back briefly. I mean, this is really good artwork here. I think one value of these old comics from especially from the 1970s is that this is valuable for an artist just to study the line work. There is and look at the angles, look at the expressions, hear the action with the sword. I mean, there is so much to learn. And look, we get a little letter. Stanley has stepped down, so it's was a Jim Shooter took over, and Marvel is really selling its comics in a way that it doesn't nowadays, unfortunately. Now, this sequence here comes the closest to being very cinematic. These short panels, the reader just reads them very quickly, and this is really taking advantage of the comic book medium. But I mean, we're already at the end, and we really haven't had any time to breathe this story. So I don't want to sound too negative about this. I think this is a good indication of story of how they would adapt a film. It's just I want to be aware that there are better ways to do that. With hindsight. I'm also reading this book by Mort Gerberg. This mostly is about magazine comics. So we're talking about one panel New Yorker type cartoons, with desert islands and businessmen and stuff. I'm probably not going to talk too much about this book because there's not a lot to share. It's a lot of, I guess we would say, inside baseball, a lot of how to get ideas and things like that. But there are chapters in here about comic strips, comic books, greeting cards, and there is a lot of insight to visual storytelling. So when something does come up, I will mention it. So anyway, as for my art progress, yesterday I finished inking this strip. This one didn't turn out too bad. And today I will start penciling in the next one. It's they're going to school. Obviously, I haven't gotten very far. And I'm hoping to paint the next few pages in the sketchbook. This was not intended for paints, and the paper is warping, but that's all right. I mean, this was a fun little project. So anyway, I will keep you appraised as to my art progress, and I will talk to you later. Goodbye.